Friends, welcome back to the table, and what a surprise! A returning guest. I don't know the history of the Collective's conversation. I've had a two-time guest.
Wow.
But you are now, not that I'm two-timing on you, but you're a
Right.
two-time guest.
History. Making history.
Well, we are history makers, I believe.
true.
So
That's true.
the people are clamoring for more of the conversation. To those of you that have commented and reached out, thank you for letting us know that you appreciated it. That you appreciated us telling our story and sharing the story, and the story of us meeting, and then our story of us reconnecting and all those things and how that affects the ministry. And we just want to kind of continue that story. We introduced people to the meet cute, or not the meet cute of 1998. I guess it wasn't a meet cute because I was married and you were 18, as we well established.
Yes.
But during that time was a significant season of our life. We talked very favorably about our Lee experience. And it was. I loved Lee University. I still talk to professors. It was so impactful. That was 50% of the impact.
Absolutely.
For us, what was the other 50%? What would you say?
The local church that we became a part of was a significant piece as well, and the people there. And there was some overlap on how we got there to that local church. But I would even say the local church I attended before my freshman year, also really impactful in people there and things I got to be a part of.
Yeah. The local church that lots of us from Lee ended up at, sort of without choice. Our friend and mentor, who was leading Backyard, we've talked about Backyard and the importance of that in our life, made it non-negotiable for us to come almost. I mean, for me, was it for you?
At least to try it, at least to come and visit.
Yeah, I mean, it was every Wednesday at Backyard, he's like, you have to come. And eventually I just gave way and broke down and snuck in a side door and was like, I probably should come here.
Yeah.
So.
He was persistent in the gamble that if you went once, that it wasn't about anything, the people there, but it was about what was happening. He was pretty confident in the gamble that if you got there, then you probably were going to come back.
I feel like persistent is a kind word for how he treated that. It was almost non-negotiable. I feel like it was just like you had to come. And I think anytime God's moving in a place, God's stirring in a place, and it was probably, for me, I would say the closest thing to a revival atmosphere I've been in.
For sure.
Was that 2 to 3 year stretch of that church. But anytime God's doing something, I think people get that way, though. Like, you've got to come see what God's doing. I think biblically we see it. Come see this Jesus I met. And that was the atmosphere from 99 to 01, 02 at that local church, that for some young adults who were trying to serve the Lord and serve the kingdom, it was just magnetic. So I came on there and began serving immediately in the youth ministry.
Yeah, you were official. You became an actual intern.
Not right away. Like, I was slave labor for the first year, not an actual intern. There was no titles handed out.
That is true.
I feel like you were more favored than I was.
Yeah, I didn't have a title. I was just sort of maybe a catch-all. Sure, Rachel will do it.
But it was a growing church and growing fast. And
yeah.
So in that season, there was a need for people to step into space. And with this sort of influx of college students and young adults from there. And there was not just college students, but like young families were showing up.
Yeah.
Because of what God was doing, there was this great need for people to serve.
Right.
And what our pastor, who's now a friend of ours, saw in a lot of us was not just bodies, not just warm bodies, but young adults who wanted to really do something for the kingdom, and he leverages that big time.
Yeah, and again, like William, it was a non-negotiable. It was, which is a really important piece, I think, sometimes of leadership, of if this is who you say you are, then these are the things that you do.
Right.
And so that was very non-negotiable. If you say you're this, then these are things that you will do. And it was very clear, and there wasn't a lot of space for ambiguity. There wasn't a lot of space for even the idea of I still lived in Orlando. Like, I was still going home on breaks and whatever. But when I was here, I was all in. And that was part of the vision maybe, or the workings of the church, that you were all in, and this was because you were still, listen, we can still quote it, we're sharing Jesus with the world, circles of sharing, and like you were committed to the Great Commission. You joined this local church. I was told I did not join a denomination, I joined a local church.
Yeah.
And we were all in on the Great Commission.
I don't sing on this show, but if I
Thank
did,
God.
I would sing the Sharing Jesus for the World jingle.
Let's
That
not.
is like living in my head rent free right now as you say that. Like the whole melody is being played out, you know. But it was such a, and we've talked about it, like in the DNA of what came out of the church we planted, and we'll get to that story eventually. But I think about the stage of that season. Our pastor at the time was maybe 42. The staff was all in their early to mid 30s. And a Sunday, typically, half the people on stage were under the age of 27.
Yeah.
Which at the time was revolutionary, and we didn't know it.
Well, and you say that, and that's those are true statements. The other thing that strikes me about the staff and those who were sort of key, the leadership, is they all had at least one, and typically more than one, somebodies they were bringing along with them. Somebody they were training. Right. Somebody they were training to, I wouldn't say do their job, but that they were training in the ways of what they do, and that very much impacted everything, because there was this constant sense of learning and growing and being pushed into the next thing for everybody that was there.
Well, the DNA of the church, and it was said to us probably a lot, was replicate yourself so somebody can take your job.
Right.
It's very intentional that there was nothing that was your kingdom.
Right.
But you were building something for someone else to eventually take over.
Right.
Which is the interesting story, because at 25, our friend William steps out of the way and goes on to Lee University, where he's been in the same or similar role for now 20 plus years. And a 25-year-old, very unskilled, green, sure, we'll go green. That's a kind way to say it. Gifted but unskilled kind of young youth pastor of me takes over where William had been. And even then, it was our pastor taking a risk on young leadership.
Right.
And there was a lot of moments and a lot of times of correction, which I didn't always receive really well, admittedly. But just coaching a young leader. I know you had the same in certain circumstances there.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about some of that and what impact that had.
I even at the time I had no interest in teaching little people, but the greatest need at the time was in kids ministry, and I was an education major at Lee, and at the ripe age of 19, and was brought on by the children's pastor at the time to go, okay, let's do this. And before I knew it, I was filling in for her. I did one Sunday, she did 3 for the most part. And then eventually I took over where I was running, because again, the church was growing by leaps and bounds. I was running the entire preschool ministry piece, not by myself, but I was kind of leading that in the span of like 2 or 3 years, because I learned what to do from her. I was on the job training, here, this is the way, let's go this way, let's do this is how we do this. And everything from, hey, we're having this big event that is military themed, so you're going to go to the recruiting office here in Cleveland and pick up these fatigues that we've asked for, to, oh, guess what? Here's a giant bathtub in this space we're renovating. Now let's wash last year's Easter eggs before we refill them and do this huge Easter egg event. And so all those things were part of this training. It was not at all glamorous, but it was immensely valuable, because it wasn't about the tasks always that were being assigned or done. It was about the time and space with the people who were leading those things.
Right. And I think what has to be said, because we have a lot of friends who are listening who are in church leadership, right? Yeah. And they just need people, and they're like a desperation pull. I'm going to find an 18, 19-year-old, stick them into leadership because I have nobody else. This was not that.
No. This was not, No.
For either one of us. It was a strategic choice to invest in next generation.
Right. And
then we both have moved on from that. Again, you moved back to Orlando. I moved on to Illinois, then to lived on the Illinois-Wisconsin border, became a youth pastor up there. But something about that season never let go of us. I know for myself, I don't know until maybe a decade later that I knew how important it was, how valuable it was.
So what made you realize it was important?
Honestly, the next post, the next position. When a great pastor, growing church, things were good, and very appreciative of that pastor in Zion, was just different relationally in how he coached and led people. Very hands off, put you in your spot, and you go do your things. Where I didn't have the coaching I got from William and from Billy and Jeff Burkhart and just the multitude of others who were just kind of around. Some of the, what we call senior saints, the Elva Howards and the JC and Dorothy Kagels, and some of these people who were senior saints at the time who were encouraging and coaching even in their love, it kind of wasn't there.
Right.
And I realized how valuable that was and how rare that was.
Yeah.
Did you find any of that outside of our time here in Cleveland?
The same mentality.
Yeah, the same approach.
Not really. I would say that I took and I started to replicate that. Always being a little bit probably on the arrogant side. I felt like I was now able to be the leader and could bring people along with me, which is what I did.
At 18, you felt that way.
Well, that's true. But and which is what I did, and so I did do some things. I started the high school I taught at, the National Honor Society. We started our own backyard with the Boys and Girls Club. Same mentality, same DNA, we'll call it. Did that there and used a lot of the skills I learned at backyard, at the church, even into silly things like when I became prom sponsor, like skills I learned that were not ministry skills, but just leadership things I learned, carried over into my actual job. But yeah, I can't recall a time or a place that I was as much mentored in that sense as I was during that season. But I also know that it put in me from that moment on that, oh, this is what you do.
Right.
So when you're the person who has the title or who has the responsibility, then you bring somebody along with you and show them the way.
Right.
And that, I think, is what the impact was that I wouldn't say I stopped being mentored, but I began to mentor.
Well, we don't have a whole lot of time to pack this, and it's something that you and I both have shared on different spaces, is what was taught to us is the Paul, Barnabas, Timothy methodology of mentoring and discipleship.
Yeah.
We simply shifted into our Paul era.
Right.
And we begin to bring along those who God put in our life. As we stepped into leadership, you and I have had conversations on our couch about the number of people who we've called spiritual sons and daughters because we bought into the principle of, if I invest in you, you now turn around and invest in somebody else.
Right.
And so the legacy for us and the legacy for those that invested us is those that we've left as a legacy.
Right.
And in hopes that they've done the same. We tell you this story to get you to where, in the timeline of the collectives, we wanted to get you to, because that season of 3 to 4 years, and for me, probably closer to 5, between the whole time I was an intern. I interned for about 3 years, was on staff for 2 years, and then left the local church here in Cleveland. There was just this belief that was installed, whether intentional or unintentional, the hand of God or just my own preference, of this young adult, invest in them, like pour everything you have into them because they're going to go do something great. Mm-hmm. And when we married in 2017 and decided because we were both ministry minded, it was our heart. Mm-hmm. We weren't really pursuing a pastorate or a church or any of those things right off the bat, but we felt like we had to give somewhere. We started a Bible study. Yeah. Connected to that same local church, actually. Mm-hmm. And we had a ragtag bunch of boys.
Yes.
Young men who kind of found a home in our home.
Yeah.
Ate us out of house and home on a Sunday night, and we just began investing in them, which was great. But there was a problem. What was the problem?
One problem is there's no girls, and problem number two is we weren't actually a church.
They knew that, but didn't know that.
Right.
And we weren't calling ourselves pastors.
Right.
There were no titles. We were Jeff and Rachel. We were giving them pretzels and some sweet tea.
Right.
And a Bible study. But they would come to us and in public refer to us as their pastors. And the expression from us was,
we're not your pastors. This is not your church.
This is not your church. This is not your church. And then at a real crossroads of our life, we left that local church and had to make a decision. Do we keep doing this thing, a young adult Bible study, college Bible study out of our house, separate from the church we were part of?
Yeah. And that's, so I'm going to go back to something about, we didn't have an actual college young adult ministry at the church we attended when we were college students.
No.
And I think that's something that when I talk theory or whatever, when I talk critically, is I look now and I go, I was so ingrained in the local body. There wasn't this way, what is the term you use? Silo, right? These siloed ministries of middle school ministry, youth ministry, college ministry, single ministry, senior adult ministry, widow ministry, single women ministry, mom's ministry, dad's ministry, just men, just women. Like there wasn't all of this. It was very much, and I'm sure there was some of those pieces, right? But we were so integrated into just the church as a whole.
So let's take a step back. Because I want to give the church timeline as the big church, okay, Big C Church. Mm-hmm. This is 99, 2000, 2001. Passion starts, the Passion movement starts in 97.
Right.
So this sort of idea of young adult ministry, which Passion helped fuel,
right,
was just sort of hitting the ground, but mostly in local colleges and mostly in secular or state kind of colleges. Right. So yeah, in the late 90s, early 2000s, college young adult ministry was primarily on campuses. The local church was not having that.
No.
They had separate youth ministry, but college kids were just part of the church.
You were 18 and you were an adult.
Yeah.
So be in big kid church and do big kid things.
Right.
You were, but that's important. And the reason I wanted to note that is because we were like, we don't want to be a silo. We don't want to be your only space or this is just your ministry. We want to help integrate you into the larger body and facilitate that, but all the while kind of caring for you as we see, this need.
Right.
So it was very, that whole time period of what we called 30 below was very conflicting for us.
Yeah.
I mean, would you agree? Like
100%.
We were in constant sort of conflict because we were like, no, we're not a church. We want you to be a part of the church. We're just a place for you to come and learn and study and all of those things and to be poured into so you can pour out in your local church.
Right.
And nobody seemed to catch that. It was always, no, this is what I do.
These are my pastors, Jeff and Rachel. We're like, no, we're not your pastors.
That's not it. That's not what we're doing.
And it was a lot of, listen, and we've had conversations with those young adults from the first, it was really seasons and eras from the first group of boys and then the really big group of girls that came behind them. A lot of them were Lee students. And they've echoed back to us the value of that time, which is significant. And what we were just doing was the work of discipleship. We weren't trying to pastor them.
Right.
We were trying to invest in them biblically, try to give them space to ask tough questions, which young adults naturally have.
Right.
The season of life and development they're in. Trying to give them just that opportunity to flesh some of that out, flesh out their own faith. I mean, we had some wins and we had some losses in that.
100%.
But we were just trying to give them space, and in that, what they recognized was that we were pastoring them. But over and over, the sentiment in that 3-4 year stretch of that initial, what we call 30 below, and eventually becomes the collectives that meets in our house, and was, we're not your church.
Right.
And so how do you think for you got to this place where going, maybe it's a church?
I don't know. I have to really think about that.
No, we were attending a local church.
Right. We were,
Not involved, but attending a local church.
Right. Taking bench time to decide what was next.
Yes.
is what that was, which was a good season in some ways.
I might blame your dad.
Oh, we can always blame him. That's my number one.
Love your dad. We would drive around. We were in business together at the time, and we'd drive around, and he would just say, "That'd make a good church building." Mm-hmm. That really deep voice he has. That's a good church building. But let's go see if that's going to be a good church building.
Yeah.
And I'm like, who's starting a church? I don't know if I was starting it or he was starting it.
I don't think he knew.
Both options were open, I think.
Exactly. Both options were there. I would say that in it wasn't really a church until we got to this crossroads of maybe we should dip our toe in this water they call church planting. We kind of have this little group of people. We kind of have some people who would probably come along. What would that maybe kind of sort of look like? Mm-hmm. And again, conflicted because the biggest part was we were conflicted is because why does Cleveland need another church?
Oh, we get asked that a lot.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's a whole episode in and of itself.
Right.
Okay. So, but we asked that question. Like, we would sit in our den, office, whatever you want to call it. We were both working from home at the time, and we would sit in there and be like, do we really think that we should do a church? Should we really plant a church? Is this really what this is becoming? So I would say it was not a moment in time. I would say it was much more evolutionary. I'm not sure I was convinced it was a church until people came on that first Sunday. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's people here.
I don't know if I was convinced the whole time we did it.
Okay, maybe. That's true too. Oh wow, is this really a church? Yeah, that's true too. Because it always felt from Sunday to Sunday, Bible study, or once we had a church building, it was always, we're going to do that again tonight. Okay. Like, this is what we do. But
and we didn't know who was showing up.
We never knew who was showing up.
Even with the Bible study.
Right. And so, but it was, when I say this is who we are, this is what we do, it's because it was.
Right.
It was our DNA. For us, not much changed from the Sunday night 30 Below to Sunday night the Collectives.
Right.
It was not a big shift for us. All we did was add worship.
Right. Yeah.
And it was not
and we took an offering.
Right. Right. Which some
Sometimes
people had told us we should, sometimes we forgot, which made us, again, that's like number one and why we were not great church planners.
There's a 2-part episode in that.
Exactly. Why we're not great church planners. But yeah, I mean, sometimes we did like, we should have taken the offering. Whoops. If people want to give, they can give. But I think that was, it wasn't a big shift for us because it's what we had been doing. And essentially it was who we are and who we still are, even though we're not pastoring this church still.
Yeah.
And I think that's that's the biggest piece.
I want to couch our story against a familiar story of ours, which is the belonging. And if you've ever, I got the chance to interview Alex Seeley, who is one of the pastors of the belonging, and they started similarly in their home. They had 80 to 100 people in their basement.
Right. And
finally, I think Chris Kane looks at her and goes, "This is a church."
Yeah.
Because Alex didn't believe it. We never had 80 to 100 people in our space. Like, we had 8 sometimes.
We almost got to 80.
Well, when we were at church, but not in our home.
Right. Oh, not in our home. Yeah, no.
Not pre...
Our neighbors couldn't handle that.
Yeah, like, we had enough cars with 12 people here.
Yeah, 25 is enough for our neighbors.
So, it was at a crossroads even. It wasn't that there was just so many people that we were like, we should make this a church. It was this... wrestling with the Lord, because I wasn't 100% sure. Mm-hmm. Our heart was young adults. We didn't want all the pieces of a church plant, and even when we began, didn't have them. We wanted the intimacy of our living room in a setting of a sanctuary.
Yeah, which we found.
Which we did for a while.
Initially, yeah.
Yeah.
We did find it initially.
And I think that was the charm and the difficulty at the same point when we were talking about this idea of a living room sort of house church thing we had going on, because we didn't have worship at the house. We met, we had pretzels, and I opened the Bible and we just walked through it. There weren't series, we weren't cute. There wasn't.
Sometimes.
Well, we might focus on a book of the Bible,
right,
or something like that, but we weren't doing preaching series at our house.
Yeah, we weren't doing like intro activities and taking an offering and having a couple songs. We were not a house church, even though everybody who came said that they went to this house church.
Yes. One of the students who we still have contact with, she's not a
Yes.
student, she was a student and doing great things, found us because we bumped into her in the Aldi, and she goes, I'm looking for a house church. And I was like, well, we're not that. But we have
We're
a Bible
kind of-
study in our house.
I mean, we have a Bible study, but we're not really a church.
I mean, because it was in our house, apparently it was a house church.
Right.
And it's a student and a young lady that's doing great things for the Lord, and a success story for us.
And
But-
one we can say is the doing what we did, she's also doing.
Right.
So taking what we poured into her, and now she hosts a Bible study for young women at her home, and she does all of these things, and so she's taking that far into the next step, which is exactly what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, and it was this crossroads of going, are we a church? I mean, I think we spent a lot of time, probably more than we should have, because the Lord was probably clear and we were just kind of slow. I was slow, not we. I was slow. I'll own my part of it. In acknowledging that what God was leading us to was this experiment of planting a church primarily for college and young adults. And it was just an experiment. And we'll talk more about the experiment like on our next episode, but in this window of time, it was a conflict. And so you're one of my favorite teachers. So I'm going to let you teach our friends a little bit.
Oh,
So are you ready?
I think maybe.
Okay.
I don't know.
So for us in that season, caught somewhere between the conflict of calling, like from church, from going from couch to church, which is really what happened.
Right.
How would you coach them to help them sort out that own conflict in their life based on how we got there?
So lots of prayer and trusting the supernatural.
Okay.
And trusting the leading of the Spirit. This is, I think, probably in calling or whatever you want to say, is we often operate scared, and scared makes us operate in partial obedience, and partial obedience is still disobedience. Just like delayed obedience is still disobedience. And I think that's part of when you're wrestling out calling or what's next or how do I move forward in this. Usually it's a fear factor of risk.
Yeah.
It was a huge, to the outside world, it was a huge risk for us to plant a church in Cleveland. For me, it was like, okay, if it's wildly successful, amazing. If it doesn't go, okay. And like, I think that was for us is this idea of like, the only way to get the resolution of conflict within yourself is to go one way or the other.
Well, and I don't know that the other resolves the conflict.
Right.
I mean,
the
I
only
think
thing.
if you walk in disobedience, I think much like the story of Jonah, eventually the Lord's going to draw you back to that.
Right.
Yeah,
He's not going to let it go. What is obedience? He's not going to let go from your perspective or from your viewpoint. He's going to keep that in front of your face.
Yeah.
So every time we turned around, it was somebody saying something like, "Oh, do you guys have a house church? Oh, you guys had this Bible study." Every time we turned around, people were saying that, and we were like, "Well, maybe we are. Maybe we do. I don't know." And it's funny. Are we going to tell the email story? Because it's funny to me.
We can start there. Are we getting there and leave the next episode there?
So I said something to you about like I wouldn't even know who would we go with, what would we do, and you literally Googled church planting.
Well, I Googled Assemblies of God we were really looking for a church.
Right, we were looking for a church.
So I Googled Assemblies of God in Cleveland, Tennessee.
Right, and there weren't.
There was sort of one.
Well, but it wasn't thriving.
Right. So I went to the Tennessee District Assemblies of God page to see if there was another Assemblies of God in town or in the area we didn't know about.
Right.
Which would have been uncommon because we knew about most of the churches.
Most churches, right.
And on the front page was this, if you want to plant a church, click here.
Mm-hmm. And you clicked, sent an email, and we didn't hear anything. And for you, be honest.
That was a no.
That was a no.
Closed door. We are not planting this church.
That was a big fat no for you. You're like, okay, I guess we're not a church. That's fine. What else can we do? Let's,
So
move
we kept
on.
meeting.
So we just kept on, right?
Probably 4 months.
Probably 3 or 4 months. And I distinctly remember one day sitting across from you in our office at our desks and going, I think you should email that one more time. If he doesn't respond this time, then we can put the church conversation to rest and move on.
Right.
And you got an email probably within less than 12 hours.
Yeah.
Hey, let's talk.
And a Zoom set up probably within a week.
Right. And so we began that process of church planting with Church Multiplication Network, the Assemblies of God in Tennessee, all those pieces and those things kind of came together. But the only way to resolve the conflict was to pursue what was causing the conflict.
Yeah, steps of obedience.
Yeah. I mean, and then from that step of obedience, and I think I can play a lot into the Lord was testing you, testing us, whatever, with that first email, right, that didn't get responded to, that got lost somewhere in cyberspace. But to go, okay, we can't get away from it, so one more time, let's try.
And we had settled on we weren't going to go at it alone.
Right. We weren't just going to go willy-nilly, we're independent crazies.
We felt we needed a covering,
Right.
some sort of organization.
Right.
We had wrestled out the two local denominations here, the Church of God and Church of God of Prophecy, and didn't feel like that was the right option or where the Lord was leading.
Right.
And so we were at that crossroads. And I think, to your point, when you're in the midst of calling in conflict or the conflict of calling, the resolution comes with sometimes the first step of obedience.
Yes, always.
Partial obedience, like you said, is disobedience, and sometimes partial obedience is not really taking a step sort of in the right direction, but almost a side step to a safety step.
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to go to where the ground is safe and step that way that looks kind of like what God's calling me to.
Right. Where I still feel safe.
Yeah, because when we decide to plant a church, we have a small ragtag bunch of people.
Some of whom were gone in 3 weeks.
Well, yeah, even before we planted. We just had this small group meeting in our house.
Yes.
We had no money but the $250 we had set aside on our own to kind of start a checking account for the church. No strategic plan at this point.
No.
And here we are going, I think we're going to turn this Bible study into a church plant. And really what led us there was the email.
Yeah.
I don't know that if we don't find somebody to walk alongside us, like Church Multiplication Network in the Tennessee District did during that season, if we ever leave our house.
Right. Yeah, I mean, probably not. But it did work that way. And I think one of the things that we've also had to wrestle out is that, like any Bible story or Bible character you can look at, that there's purpose in that journey, but that journey is not the be all and the end all. And I think that's where we find ourselves now, is that was definitely a distinct next step in our journey of being called to discipleship, which is what I'll say we're called to, is discipleship. That was the next step that the Lord had us walk out, but it doesn't mean that's the end of what the Lord has for us.
Right.
Like, it wasn't the only thing.
Right.
And I think that, has come to, in the last 6-9 months, has come to a real clarity or point of clarity for me, is that I can look and go, that was a good season, that was a hard season, that was a necessary season, it was the right thing at the right time, but it wasn't the be all and the end all.
Yeah.
And I think that as believers, sometimes we want to just settle and go, okay, I made this step of obedience, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do, and I won't move anywhere else.
Right.
And I think that's not what the Lord has for us. I think He has this, okay, so this was good, so now we're going to move to the next thing. And because I don't think we're meant to stay stagnant. I think we have plenty of examples in the Bible, Paul particularly, of like, hey, this was great. I planted you guys, got you guys going, and now I'm going to move on to the next place and get this going. And so I think for us, we have to settle our hearts and going, it was really good for a season, and it was the right season, but it's not necessarily the be all and the end all.
And I think this shift, I love words and was the mastermind behind most of the words of the things with the collectives, but my love affair with words is we went from this place of this is not your church to this is just an experiment.
Right.
And when we talk next time, we'll talk about
reaching, raising, and releasing.
The great experiment.
Yeah.
And with all experiments, eventually they end and you got to check the results.
Exactly.
And so next time we sit down at this table, you and I, we'll talk about the great experiment called the collectives.
Great.
Till then, you've always got to see the table. Talk to you soon. Wow, what a great conversation that was. Thanks for joining us in the conversation. If something from the conversation really stood out to you, would you share it and tag me on social media at Jeff_Pitts_ on Instagram? And we would love it if you would rate and review and subscribe to the show. That just helps us reach more people with these great conversations. And as we always say, you've got to see the table. Thanks for joining the conversation.